Welcome creatures, welcome to Thursday. Today is December the 29th, and on this day in 1845, the Republic of Texas is being annexed by the United States. Also, interestingly enough, at the same time, roughly 1400 miles to the east and also roughly 250 years before, Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan leader Wahunse Nakau, is pleading to save the life of John Smith from execution and succeeds to do so. Unfortunately for today, we will have to execute a few of the specs that are considered garbage, because what is going on for today is the update, the weekly update to the Mythic Plus meta, to how things have been going on in Mythic Plus after we have just gone through our first tyrannical week of the season. And don't worry, based on the affixes we have left of the season, these things right here, this was the harshest of the tyrannical weeks. So from here on out, it's all smooth sailing when it comes to tyrannical. And also, you should be pretty happy that this week of Fortified is quite the handy one for pushing keys. Now, of course, we are here to start looking at specs first and foremost before we even talk about dungeons. So let's look at how things have been going for spec-related things by starting, of course, with tanks. Now, this is the situation right now with tanks so far in Mythic Plus. 1 week difference in all keys hasn't really changed much. Where we do see some changes is in the 15 and over level of keys, where the Protection Warrior manages to gain even more, a little bit more of a ground compared to all of the other tanks. There isn't really much of any change besides the slight growth of Protection Warrior, which consolidates itself as the most popular out of all of the tanks. Pretty much more than 1 in 3 keys at level 15 or above will have a Protection Warrior tanking. So that is so far our number 1 spec in terms of popularity across all of the roles. What if we have healers beating this popularity ranking of Protection Warrior? So healers at all keys, we saw last week that Preservation Evoker and Restoration Druid were the 2 specs more or less being the more popular. Once again, at the overall all key level, not too much is changing. Because we have so many entries, it's difficult to see any significant changes, but once we get into the 15 and plus level of keys, we do see that Restoration Druid is gaining more and more compared to Preservation Evoker. Preservation itself isn't actually losing. As you can see, Preservation lost 0.3% of the representation. It's Restoration Druid that is growing bigger. Sadly, I know, it's a sad note, but Mistweaver Monk grows even smaller. You have Discipline Priest growing even smaller. So the underplayed specs are remaining underplayed, and Restoration Druid is becoming more popular over time. Once again, they don't quite get to the popularity level of Protection Warrior, but they are close. They are basically at the same level of 1 in 3 keys will have a Restoration Druid healer, and roughly 1 in 4 keys will have a Preservation Evoker healing. The rest of the keys is going to be split mostly around Holy Priests and Holy Paladins so far. Then we are moving to the DPS bracket, the most popular out of all of the roles, starting with the melee DPS. Now, we already established looking at all key levels isn't really changing anything. So looking at keys at 15 or above, we don't see actually many changes for melee DPS. We do see that over the course of a week, Fury Warrior has gained a little bit more popularity. Surprisingly, even Retribution Paladin is gaining more popularity. And you might be saying, dude, it's from 3.5% to 4.5%. That's so tiny. True, but that is over a 30% increase in popularity of Retribution Paladin. So it is still worthwhile pointing out. There is also a slight decrease in Rogue players. In higher keys, there is also a slight increase of Death Knight players, and as a result, a slight decrease of the 2 of the more popular picks, which were Windwalker and Havoc. This is perhaps the more interesting change. The fact that we saw last week Windwalker and Havoc as the most popular one, and after a week, things haven't started or haven't kept snowballing in their favor. Like we saw for Prot Warrior and like we saw for Restoration Druid, this so far is not the case for those 2 specs. It seems like it is more fought after. The top spots of melee are more fought after. We see 4 different specs capable of taking the top between Fury, Outlaw, Windwalker, and Havoc Demon Hunter as well. So Definitely a more hard-fought battle to gain the meta flavor of the month spot when it comes to melee. What about when it comes to range DPS? Well, when it comes to range DPS, we do have a change. We have way less Demonology Warlocks compared to last week, and also less Marksmanship Hunters compared to last week, and also less Arcane Mages compared to last week. Now, the question is, where did all of these players go? We do have an increase, needs to be said, by almost 40% of Beast Mastery Hunters. We do also have an increase of almost 20% of Shadow Priests. We also have an increase, a significant, actually massive increase, 50% of Frost Mages. So we do have increases, which of course don't look that big, because all of these specs mentioned weren't very popular before. So the increase doesn't look that shiny. And also because even with these increases, you can still see some very clear outliers in the specs being popular right now. You have Marksmanship and Demonology. That's the first tier, and then the second tier is Arcane, Balanced Druid, and Devastation Evoker when it comes to popular specs being brought to Mythic Plus, when it comes to range DPS at least. Then we can also look at their score. Yes, just looking at the amount of players completing the keys, as well as the level of key being completed and their score in the key itself as recorded by Warcraft logs. So this is what the tank scores are telling us, and they are telling us that Blood, DK, and Protection Warrior have a meaningful gap from the rest of the tanks, where the rest of the tanks are not nearly as different from each other. They are all quite balanced, the bottom 4, and the top 2 are quite a bit ahead compared to the others. That's the first thing we can see if we were to look at the score of the tanks. We can look also at the score of the healers, which tells an even clearer picture. If you look at this, it's quite visible how Restoration Druid, Holy Priest, Preservation Evoker, and Holy Paladin have a gap, a significant gap from the bottom 3. Restore Shaman, Discipline Priest, and Mistweaver Monk. It is quite the visible one. So that is also something you can gauge from looking at their score based on the keys they are running, the level of keys they are completing, etc, etc. And then lastly, we can look at the scores of the DPS players. This is where we see, of course, the largest gaps, the biggest divides when it comes to performance. 2 of the rogue specs, even though one of these 2 is very unpopular, so to speak. It's not really the pick in Mythic Plus, but Subtlety Rogue is performing super well the few times it is getting into keys. We also see specs we haven't mentioned too much before, like for example Balanced Druid, or also Enhancement Shaman doing very well. So these are the performances we have seen so far. Also, conversely, there are some popular specs we have mentioned which are not performing nearly as well, like for example Devastation Evoker. When we mentioned they were in the second tier of popularity of range DPS, they are not doing nearly as well by looking at the results so far in Mythic Plus. Then, talking about specs, we can also look at the success chance. How many chances do you have to brick, to deplete the key, or to be successful based on the specs you are inviting to your groups? So we looked after 1 week, after the first reset, the first fortified week, and the situation looked, of course, quite dire. Even the better specs were struggling to be above 55%. The worst specs were even getting closer to the 40% mark. So after a second full week, things have gotten, of course, much better. As you can see here, now the worst of the specs, Devastation Evoker, is all the way up to 58%. 58% after a week of Mythic Plus would have put you in second place. And now this 58% is the worst. So, of course, things have gotten much better. Many of the already popular specs are sporting the best success chance on completing a key. Windwalker, Outlaw, Enhancement, Havoc are quite the popular specs already. A surprise Feral Druid and a surprise Elemental Shaman show up at the top of the success rate of completing keys, and at the bottom, if we had to look at the popular specs, we have already mentioned Devastation Evoker being quite disappointing, as we just saw from the performance. Devastation Evoker was also in the bottom half of performance, so this is in line with what you can expect in a key with a Devastation Evoker. And then surprisingly, we also have something we have mentioned before. We do have the much higher presence of melee specs compared to ranged specs, because for example balance, arcane and demolock, which we mentioned being the outstanding performers for example for the ranged DPS, are all middle of the pack in here compared to the melee specs all being at the top. So that is once again yet another type of stat we can look at, which tells us that melee DPS are performing better in Mythic Plus right now. But this is not all when it comes to stats and numbers, because if you remember, we looked at this last week. We looked at the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus. So TLDR, how many chances, how often will you see a group like this in Mythic Plus? And this was the most popular. These were the most popular comps in Mythic Plus. Now, it's been an extra week, an extra reset, different affixes. What has changed compared to the first time we looked at this? What has changed, first of all, is that nothing changed for tanks, because Protection Warrior is still part of the most popular comps. That is still the same. But what changed instead is the switcheroo between Preservation Evoker and Restoration Druid. The first time we looked at this, there were just 5 Restoration Druids and the other 7 were Preservation Evokers. Now there are only 4 Preservation Evokers and the remaining 8 are all Restoration Druids. So we have gotten a switcheroo in terms of healers. Now it's 2/3 Resto Druid and 1/3 Preservation Evoker, when before it was basically the opposite. There has also been a change when it comes to DPS. Last week, before getting into the new tyrannical reset, the predominant picks in terms of popular comps in Mythic Plus were Outlaw, Demonology, and Havoc. Those were the standout picks. This week, Outlaw is still there. Outlaw is still present in every single one of the most popular key comps with the exception of one. But Demonology Warlock has lost quite a bit. Now it's only present in 4 out of 12 of these comps, whereas before it was in 7 out of 12 of these comps. What has changed? Well, we see Arcane Mage now being part of the groups, replacing Demonology as the only ranged pick in the groups. First of all, we do still see Havoc, but we do see more Windwalker. Now there are 6 out of 12 groups having a Windwalker Monk. So the main change is a slightly lower presence of Demo, a slightly lower presence of Havoc in favor of specs like Windwalker and Arcane Mage compared to the last time we looked at the most popular comps. And for now, this was all we had to look at for today when it comes to the recap, the weekly recap of Mythic Plus key levels. Of course, tomorrow probably, maybe midweek, we will take a look at the week itself. So this new fortified week, which bodes to be quite the nice push week, given how simple the affixes are. But for today, just by looking at the recap of what happened in Mythic Plus up to now, especially with a focus on the specs rather than a focus on the dungeons, this is what we have seen. So with this out of the way, congratulations to all of the specs doing fine right now. I hope you are happy you chose the correct spec to be flavor of the month and get invited into keys, and I'm sorry to everyone who believed the Shadow Priest meme or the Red Paladin dream. You kind of brought it upon yourself, that one. So, with this out of the way, we can start by thanking, of course, all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and supporting myself and this channel. You can still, of course, support in other ways, not including the expenditure of dinero. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are plenty fine ways to show your support. You can also support by following me on Twitter. That will be quite helpful, and also it might alert you on whenever I am going live on stream. I have been pausing my streams in the last few days because of the Christmas holidays, but we are starting very soon. In fact, I might be losing track of time, but I should have gone live yesterday, I believe, or tonight, I believe. So being on Twitter might definitely help you keeping track of whenever I go live. And then, of course, you can follow me by checking out my stream on Twitch. I start streaming, generally speaking, from 10 p.m. Central European times, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, my throat was getting so dry. I should have stopped in the middle, honestly.